Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. Thank you for joining us for our presentation, Understanding and Leveraging Organizational Culture, presented by Professor Emily Bianchi of Emory University's Goizueta Business School, in collaboration with Ivy Exec. My name is Muriel. I am on the higher education team here at Ivy Exec, and I'll be helping to moderate today's session. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items for our audience. First of all attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage you to engage in the session by asking questions to our presenter, which you can do so using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We do encourage questions during the presentation, but we will also have a formal Q&A session during the last 15 minutes of the presentation. Additionally, we are recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of the recording via email in the coming days. And now, I would like to introduce you to today's presenter. Professor Emily Bianchi holds a PhD in management from Columbia University and a BA in psychology from Harvard. Bianchi's research, published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and many more, examines how the state of the economy shapes attitudes and behaviors ranging from individualism to ethics. Her work also looks at how economic conditions in early adulthood influence later job attitudes, self-concepts, and moral behavior. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Professor Bianchi.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today and to interact with people all over the world. Wherever you are, welcome, and thanks for taking the time out of your busy day to talk a little bit about culture. And this is a subject that I think is really important. It is important for organizations in terms of how they attract employees, how they retain employees, and ultimately how satisfied those employees are with the work they do and the organization that they work for. As was mentioned, I'm a professor of organizational behavior here at Emory. I teach an undergrad course in organizational behavior to Emory juniors and seniors. And we talk about a whole bunch of topics from motivation all the way through organizational culture to the end of the class. So I want to start off by giving you kind of a flavor of three very different organizational cultures. So if you think for a minute about what it might have been like if you walked into Amazon in, let's say, 1999, 2000, in its very early days. And if you spent the day there, you might notice that this is a company that focuses on frugality above all else. So for years at Amazon, most of the desks were made of doors, and that was simply because that was the cheapest way to do it. The story goes that in the early days of Amazon, the company couldn't afford to buy desks for employees. So Jeff Bezos and other executives went to the scrapyard nearby, picked up some spare doors, and made their own. And by many accounts, these first early desks were incredibly wobbly. But over the years, they figured out how to make desks out of doors that were much more stable. But even now, now that it's a major company, known all over the world, even now, desks there are often made out of doors. And that is kind of a reminder of the early days of the origins of Amazon and its continued emphasis on frugality. If you walk into an organization called SAS, which is in Cary, North Carolina, it's a data analytics computer software company, you would probably notice that most employees start off the day by dropping their children off at the heavily subsidized daycare center that's in the lobby. There's on-site medical care, there's on-site personal trainers, there's subsidized cafeterias, there's unlimited sick days, and typically the doors are locked by 6 p.m. And the idea here is that this is an organization that considers its people its most valuable asset, and it does everything to keep them well-fed, happy, and eager to come to work the next day. If you walked into IDEO, a design firm headquartered in Palo Alto, California, you would see bicycles hanging from the ceiling, you would see dogs at people's feet. Employees there design their own working areas and often use these areas to show off their creativity and their individuality. When you walk into IDEO, you'll see colorful paper clips, pens, and other tools encouraging employees to kind of make creative projects. Around the office, there are places where employees can exercise their creativity. There's a wall that has mural of Instagram photos. There's an area where people dump their old office supplies and people then use those to make various creations. There's a piano where people sit and play and sing. And this is a company that is focused on innovation. They're famous for making innovative products. And their culture values creativity, they value collaboration, and they value innovation. And so their culture is designed to reinforce and to make it easy for employees to live that mission. So these are three companies that represent very different organizational cultures, each of which serves their particular objectives quite well. They have different values, they have different goals, they're in different industries, they have different ultimate objectives. These reflect just a small fraction of the many, many different types of organizational cultures that are out there. And today I'm going to talk about what culture is, how you can tell what kind of culture an organization has, why having a strong cultural organizational culture is often, but not always, advantageous, and finally, how organizations can create and perpetuate their organizational culture. Now, quite simply, what exactly do we mean when we say an organizational culture? And from a definitional sense, what organizational scholars, how they define it, is a system of shared values and norms that define what is important and what is appropriate behavior in an organization. So you can think of culture as an organization's DNA. It's programming. And like any DNA, it's invisible to the naked eye, yet is an incredibly powerful template that shapes behavior at all levels of an organization. Organizational culture can tell you things like, how does business get done? How do everyday tasks that we all have to accomplish at work, how do we do them? Do we work together? Do we work alone? Do we strive to have the ultimate quality, highest quality in everything we do? Or are we just focused on getting things done, and perhaps in that organization cutting corners is encouraged and appropriate? Is the customer always right? Is the shareholder always right? Are employees always right? Is the CEO always right? What's important and valued? Organizations have tremendously different values. Some organizations focus on frugality above everything else. Some organizations focus on creativity, others collaboration, others efficiency, others innovation, and still many, many more values out there. How is organizational performance attained? How do we meet our objectives? Do we focus on short-term profits, even if it might ultimately harm the company in the long term? Do we cut corners to meet numbers? How do we measure our success, right? You can think of a lot of different metrics in which organizations might use to measure their success. Is it about stock performance, quarterly profits, annual profits, growth, customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction? And many organizations would answer that question very differently, and that is an indicator of their cultural values. Now, organizational culture is an incredibly powerful tool to help coordinate behavior and accomplish goals. So I'll get back to this a bunch in this talk because it really is kind of why we care about culture, right? It helps organizations be successful. And it helps organizations be successful on a whole host of different metrics. So in a meta-analysis of 93 studies, and if you know some about how statistics works, meta-analysis is sort of the gold standard in hard sciences and in social sciences for how we understand, what relationships are between various variables. And in a meta-analysis of 93 studies, over 16,000 companies, almost 60,000 employees, it's been shown that outcomes for companies with strong culture are positive on a host of different metrics. So first, in terms of employees who work for organizations with a strong organizational culture report greater job satisfaction. They report greater commitment to the organization. In terms of output of the organization, organizations with stronger cultures have a greater quality of products and services as ranked by third parties. They have a higher rate of revenue, growth of revenue. They're rated as more innovative, in studies that have looked at patents filed and looked at the independent variable as a strength of organizational culture, it's been shown that companies with stronger organizational cultures produce more patents, right? They have more innovation on a whole host of different metrics and greater profit as well. And finally, people, their end users respond well to positive organizational cultures. Generally, when people are more satisfied with their jobs and more committed to their organization, they tend to be better stewards of that organization. So especially in things like service organizations, when employees are happy, when they feel committed and to the culture that they work for, the company they work for, they tend to have more satisfied customers, right? They probably go the extra mile for that customer. They kind of exude the positivity that they feel from their organization. And finally, market performance. When you just look at stock market performance, studies have shown that stronger organizational cultures have greater performance on this metric as well. So let me give you an example of an organization that has a very strong culture and also has very strong performance across a host of different metrics, from employee attitudes to things like lower costs, which in this industry is particularly important. And that's the Mayo Clinic. And this is an organization I'll come back to a few times as we talk today, because it's an organization that again has a very strong culture and is able to create an environment that both benefits employees and helps the bottom line. So if you know anything about the Mayo Clinic, and many of us have heard of it in kind of cultural lore because it's a very famous medical center, right? And so it sees people who have particularly difficult medical problems and who often travel from all across the country and sometimes all across the world to go to this center. It's located in Rochester, Minnesota, and it's often ranked the #1 hospital in the world, according to the U.S. News and World Report. And the success of the Mayo Clinic is often attributed to the culture, which does things differently than the way we typically do things in healthcare in the United States. So in most of American healthcare, patients rotate between various specialists, right? You might go to a cardiologist, you might go to a dermatologist, and it's pretty unlikely that those two people speak to each other about your care. And so people often talk about it as a very disjointed experience, especially if you have a very serious medical condition that you're often, shuffled between specialists, but nobody's really overseeing and coordinating your total treatment. And at the Mayo Clinic, that is their emphasis. So they have teams of doctors that focus on kind of the total care of the patient. Doctors work collaboratively. So they work together. The dermatologist will work with the cardiologist, and they will collectively kind of work on addressing the whole patient. They do things differently there. So doctors are salaried, which is they're not kind of paid by tests. They're not paid by patient seen, which many people blame for some of the many challenges we have in our healthcare system. And most importantly, doctors are encouraged to work together. So the emphasis really is on the patient. And as a result, this is an organization that's not only incredibly successful in terms of being ranked kind of one of these most preeminent hospitals in the world, but it's also one of the lowest costing hospitals in the world. And on average, in a given year, there are fewer scans and procedures. Again, people aren't compensated by scan, by procedure. They're all salaried. And again, it's successful across all of these different metrics. Not only is it ranked the #1 hospital in the nation, typically, not always, but by U.S. News and World Report, but they also attract the best, many wonderful doctors. And they have a lower voluntary turnover rate than comparable hospitals in the world. So people are really drawn to work there, and they are motivated to stay. So how do we assess an organization's culture? It is often said that culture is like an iceberg, right? There are things above the surface that are easily observable to an outsider, right? Things like the buildings that house the organization, the language that people use in the organization, the rituals that people follow, the stories that people tell. there are also, and these are things that are, again, above the surface that are easily visible. There are also the values that the organization espouses, right? So in many organizations, you will see value statements, maybe in the break room, maybe in the lobby, but they are often very visible and very apparent to outsiders. And these are the things that the organization says that they care deeply about. Below the surface, it's much more difficult to see what the organization's actually enacted values are, right? So organizations often say that they value certain things, but when you kind of talk to the people who work there, they will tell you a different story. And so the enacted values are below the surface and harder for outsiders to detect. And then there's the underlying assumptions. And I'll give you examples of all of these sort of things, both above and below the surface. One of the most visible manifestations of culture is the use of space. And I also think this is kind of one of the most interesting ones to look at as an outsider. What kind of buildings does the organization inhabit? How do these reinforce the organization's central values? Right? Buildings can both create and also reflect culture. So Winston Churchill once famously said, "We shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us." So if you think about kind of the way that spaces are structured or organized, they can be organized in a lot of different ways. They can be organized in ways that facilitate collaboration, right? You can have a lot of common spaces. You can have a lot of common meeting rooms. You can have a lot of open areas. You can organize a building in a way that emphasizes hierarchy, right? Perhaps there's a separate floor or maybe even a separate building for all the executives. In some cases, there's a separate entrance for executives, and so they never sort of interact with other people in the organization. Or perhaps there's a more of an emphasis on a flat hierarchy where kind of everybody comes in the same way, everybody works in the same kind of environment. I'll give you an example of two buildings that reflect very different organizational cultures. The first is Wal-Mart, right? So this is the corporate headquarters of Wal-Mart. And I think it says a lot about the organization, and it also reflects the organization's central value, which above all is frugality, right? And the headquarters of Walmart, unlike many sort of large Fortune 500 or even Fortune 100 companies in this country, is in Bentonville, Arkansas, right? So it's in a pretty rural place. It's a series of utilitarian buildings. They're not particularly flashy. They're not particularly ornate. They're bare bones. And again, emphasizing kind of this value that Walmart has. According to people who go negotiate for Walmart, this is an organization in which when you negotiate, you go into kind of one bare bones contract negotiation room that doesn't have a lot of beautiful artwork on the wall, but instead has a framed picture of Sam Walton, and that's about it. So again, this kind of this building re-emphasizes the central value at Walmart, which is frugality above all else. Contrast that to a very different type of building. This is the headquarters of Bloomberg in New York City. And this emphasizes this is a space that is clearly set up with a very different kind of cultural values in mind. This is a building built primarily out of steel and glass, and it's designed what many people call it the beehive. There are no private offices, including for the CEO and their top executives. There are no cubicles. Even the conference room has glass walls, and the CEO sits on the third floor surrounded by his sales staff. And it's clear kind of the values that they were trying to create or trying to emphasize with this type of building. And it's really about transparency. It's also about the free flow of ideas and the ability to quickly communicate with other people around you. So the CEO at one point talked about, I want to be able to, quickly talk to people on my team without, having to feel like I'm interrupting them or feel like, they can't see what I'm doing. And I want them to be able to come and talk to me if they have an idea without feeling, that they might be interrupting me or it might not feel comfortable coming to my office. So this is you can see how these spaces really both reflect and reinforce the cultural values that organizations have. And it's sort of one of the first things you can see about an organization. And sometimes organizations consciously do this, and sometimes they are shaped by the space that they happen to have. Other ways you can, what do we call artifacts of culture, are the language, right? When we often start new jobs, there are all these sort of, there's all this lingo, there's all these acronyms that we have to learn that are specific to that particular organization. And in some cases, that language can tell you a lot about what the organization values. So for instance, Yum Brands, which runs Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, and KFC, uses the term customer maniacs. And their central cultural value is that the customer, we want to reflect incredible customer service at all junctures. We want to be incredibly responsive to our customers. And so we don't have salespeople or we don't have customer service representatives, we have customer maniacs. At Disney, right, if you've ever worked at Disney, you know that when you go to work at Disney, you're not just going to a regular job or you're clocking in and clocking out. The idea is that you are taking on a character. So if you you're not wearing a uniform, you're wearing a costume. You're not going into a job. You're taking on a character. You're taking on a role. And so again, that kind of emphasis is reflected in the language that the organization uses. There are also rituals that organizations use, right? At Walmart, there's often kind of this team rally meeting, throughout the day. At UPS, there is a 3-minute meeting with managers that managers have with their drivers. And this is both to encourage communication, which is, important in terms of getting things done, but also it also reflects another value, right? That this is only supposed to be 3 minutes. And it shouldn't be a second more because our huge cultural value at UPS is punctuality. All right, so if you're gonna do this, you're gonna have this important meeting, but you're also gonna make sure it's really quick. So these are sort of the rituals, the everyday organizational things that happen in organizations that reinforce the key values of that organization. And more formally, there are things like ceremonies, right? These are the activities, the planned activities that reinforce the key values of an organization. So the corporate events, right? What do our holiday parties look like? What do the promotion things look like? What do the earnings reports look like? There can be ceremonies for all sorts of things, right? For meeting sales goals, for reducing shrinkage, for celebrating employee tenure. But how are these conducted? That can tell us a lot about the organization. Is it something where only high-level executives are invited, or is everyone encouraged to come? Are they fun and playful, or are they very serious and formal? And, are there lavish spreads of food, decorations, or are there just a few, vegetable trays and some bottles of water, right? Is it the ceremony the same every time, which would, or is it an organization where it changes and it's spontaneous, it's different every time? And those can kind of reveal some of the values that the organization cares about. Ceremonies can be used, especially when organizations are trying to change their culture. And this is a very hard thing for organizations to do. But to give you an example, Continental many years ago was trying to change their culture because many employees felt like it was incredibly rule-bound to the point of being stifling. There was an 800-page employee manual, and many people felt it was cumbersome and impossible to know all of the rules expected of people. And so one of the kind of ceremonial things in changing that culture was what they called the burning of the old employee manual. And so they took the 800-page manual and people burned it, and then they rolled out an 80-page manual that was much more kind of easy to swallow and easy to follow. And another kind of artifact of cultures is stories, right? Stories are incredibly powerful in kind of telling what's important in our organizations, what is valued, what is really done around here. Stories can tell us, how do people rise to the top, right? Do they claw all over each other? Do they put other people down? Or do they work together? Are they collaborative? Are they inclusive? Should employees ask for help? How much help can they expect? In some organizations, this is encouraged. In other organizations, it's frowned upon. So, or people often look to the stories or tell each other stories. It's called a sense-making exercise of what's going on in the organization, what really matters here, how things really happen. How does organizations react? How does it react to mistakes? Do people get fired on the spot, right? In which case you might send the message to employees that they're better off kind of covering up things that went wrong. Or are people supported as they kind of fix the organization, fix the mistakes? What gets people fired, right? This is something that is often talked about in organizations. Why was that person let go? And it's really a sense-making exercise in terms of understanding what values the organization really cares about. And who, if anyone, can break the rules, right? Because we all have these formal kind of rule books in organizations that tell us, what rules we are to follow. But then there's also kind of the what really happens element of this as well, and stories can often indicate that. So to give you an example of an organization in which stories are very powerful, kind of in reflecting an organization's values and reinforcing those values, let's go back to the Mayo Clinic. And as I mentioned before, the Mayo Clinic is famous for patient care. There's a story told there about a critically ill mother of a bride that I think both reflects and reinforces this cultural value of being kind of focusing on the patient above all else. And the story goes that, the bride was about to get married, but her mother was incredibly ill. And her mother was seeking care at the Mayo Clinic, and there was really no chance that she was going to be able to leave the hospital. She was way too ill. So the staff at the hospital decided to put on the wedding there. And so they, within hours, they transformed the hospital atrium into a ceremony hall. People donated balloons, people procured flowers, they got confetti, staff members provided a cake, nurses arranged to do the patient's hair, to get her dressed in normal clothes, and to wheel her to the ceremony. And they did the entire ceremony in the atrium of the hospital so the mother could be there. And I think this story illustrates or underscores many parts of the organization's culture. First, that it's patient-centered, right? That everyone was focused on the patient, in this case, the mother, being able to see this kind of milestone event in her daughter's life. And it's also very collaborative. And that's sort of one of those central values of the Mayo Clinic, is to be collaborative. And in this sense, it takes a lot of people to pull off a wedding, as anybody who's ever planned one knows. And in this case, many people came together in the organization to pull off a wedding incredibly quickly for this woman. So again, we talked about kind of the above the surface thing, and the last one that's above the surface is this idea of espoused values, right? So in many organizations, this is a Whole Foods, and you can see their core values right there when you're shopping. And this is true in many organizations. I'm sure you can think of organizations that you regularly frequent where you can see their core values are on public display. In my own organization, I walk by kind of a rotating active board that often kind of tells stories of the organization that emphasizes the values of that organization. So these are the espoused values, what the organization says it believes, what it tells the world that its philosophies and norms and beliefs are. And below the surface, you have what are the enacted values, right? So in an ideal world, the espoused values, right, what an organization says it cares about, would be the same as its enacted values, what the organization actually emphasizes and rewards. But anybody who's worked in at least more than one organization knows that often these are disconnected, right? That often organizations will say they care about collaboration, but instead they reward people who are individual performers, right? They will say they care about things like helping others, but then really when it comes to promotion, all they focus on is a very individually focused performance metric. So often there is a disconnect between espoused and enacted values, and this is when organizations get into a lot of trouble because employees become incredibly cynical, right, and disgruntled because people feel betrayed. They feel that the organization is just putting on window dressing for the rest of the world and is not actually living their espoused values. So there is a huge cost to organizations when these enacted values and espoused values do not match up. To give you an example of this, a very notorious example of this, right? One of the hot collector's items on eBay is the Enron book of the Code of Ethics. And I read some parts of this, and I also teach about Enron in my organizational behavior class to undergrads. And if you know anything about the story of Enron, I mean, it really is a story of a breakdown in ethics at really every level of the organization. And when you look at the Code of Ethics, it's completely divorced from what actually happened there, right? So the Code of Ethics is what you would expect in a financial, services organization, or an organization that traded energy as they did. And it's, things like, we're going to always act in accordance with applicable laws, and in a moral and honest manner. And I don't think anybody in retrospect would argue that they were in line with those values. So, you can find all sorts of cases in organizations where companies say that they have some sort of values, a set of values, but then they don't actually live or enact those values. And finally, at the very deepest level of an organization's culture are the assumptions. These are the elements of culture that are unseen, that are hard to identify both among outsiders and even among people who work for organizations. So you can think of this as sort of an organization's operating system, right? The behind the scenes programming that influences everything that happens above the surface. And I think what's really interesting about this is that we often don't recognize these things in our organizations, particularly if we've been there a long time. We become acclimated over the years to this way of doing things, and we don't even recognize that they're culturally specific. And we can see this across cultures as well, right? We're all born into one culture. We become acclimated and familiar with kind of the norms and the rules of that culture. And we don't often realize that many of those norms are very culturally specific. And so when we go into new cultures, or whether it's national or whether it's organizational, there's often a period of sense making where we're trying to figure out what the real assumptions are in that organization about how things are done. And these are the parts of organizations that are the hardest to change, right? Because if you can't even recognize that this is a culturally specific thing, that really is the first step to be able to change that if one wanted to change an organization's culture. So this is really the very deepest and most difficult thing to change when organizations do want to change their culture. So I've talked about kind of what culture is, but very few organizations actually have strong cultures. And I want to talk about, every organization does have a culture, right? Not all organizations have strong cultures. So what really makes an organization strong? And all the organizations I put on the screen here are organizations that are known for having very strong cultures. And again, cultures which revolve around very different values and very different norms. So scholars argue that there are really kind of two aspects of culture that are necessary for it to be a strong culture. And the first is agreement about what is valued, right? The organizational members at all levels, at all parts of the company have to agree what is valued. If it's customer service, then people who are both on the front lines and who are on C-level suites have to agree, this is our central value. We are a customer service organization. If some people think you're customer service and other people think you're bottom line oriented and other people think still something different, that's not a strong culture. That is a culture that, there can be a lot of different microcosms of culture within the same organization, but for an organization to have a strong culture, everybody has to know what it stands for, right? At Zappos, everybody knows they're focused on customer service. That is their central value, and that infiltrates every level of that organization. The second thing that organizations have to have a strong culture is people have to feel strongly about these values, right? There are many organizations in which people can kind of repeat from rote memory the ideas of or the values of the culture, right? So you might be able to say, well, here are the 3 things that my culture values. But if people don't feel strongly and passionately committed to those values, it's not a strong culture, right? So really, to have a strong culture, you both have to have agreement about what's valued, and you have to feel, people in the organization have to feel passionately about those values. And I want to give you some examples of the power of strong cultures. We talked about the Mayo Clinic. That's one of a myriad of examples of how powerful cultures, how strong cultures can really serve organizations incredibly well. So an organization that is often used to reflect the power of strong cultures is Southwest Airlines. And if you've followed Southwest Airlines at all, this is a very strong and unique culture. This is a culture in which employees are kind of the backbone of this organization. This is an organization which is committed to treating employees well. Employees are encouraged to have fun. It's not hard to find a video online of somebody at Southwest doing something kind of funny or unusual, right? Like a baggage handler playing the ukulele or a pilot rapping, the safety instructions. This is an organization where people are encouraged to have fun. Leaders are encouraged to know employees both inside and outside the organization. So not necessarily socialize with them, but know kind of, look, hey, this person's about to have, their family's about to have another child, and we should really send a care package. Or this is a family who's gone through some sort of hardship, and we want to kind of rally around and support this person. So this is very much the kind of familial values of being part of what's called the Southwest family. By most people have argued that this strong culture has served Southwest very well. It's consistently rated one of the top 5 best companies to work for by Fortune magazine. It's got the lowest number of consumer complaints in the airline industry. 85% of employees say they're proud to work there, which is much higher than comparable airlines, or really any airlines. They've never laid off or furloughed an employee, which again, you want to be consistent with what you say your values are and what you actually do. And given their kind of culture, their enacted values would seem to be hypocritical if they constantly laid off employees because they're so employee centered. So again, there's a consistency there, which helps for a strong culture. And it's the most profitable airline in history, which is pretty incredible. So let's talk about some of the ways that culture can help organizations achieve better performance, right? Because this is the Mayo Clinic and Southwest are sort of these classic examples of strong cultures with incredibly profitable end results. So there are kind of 2 ways in which having a strong culture can help an organization perform better. And the first one is that it's energizing. If the values speak to you, if they appeal to you, then it's energizing. Pretty much every employee, most people, not everybody, but most people want to do something, be part of something greater than themselves. They want to commit to, they want to further a cause that's greater than themselves. Most people get into healthcare with that goal in mind, right, of helping people get better, of helping make someone's life easier. And so to the extent that organizations can leverage that energy, it's really to both the organization's end and to the individual employee's end. So you can think of the example of the Mayo Clinic, of how it would be energizing to work there if you were a healthcare professional because you felt like you were being part of something really powerful. There's a famous story from NASA from the 1960s and sort of the NASA heyday when it was, trying to prepare to put the first person on the moon. And the story goes that President John F. Kennedy was visiting NASA headquarters for the first time in 1961. And while he was touring the facility, he introduced himself to a janitor who was mopping the floor. And he asked that janitor, what do you do at NASA? And the janitor replied, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. And that really speaks to, and whether that story is true or not, I don't honestly know, but it speaks to kind of this general higher calling that many people described in that culture at NASA at the time, that everybody was energized towards this greater goal. And that infiltrated to every level of the organization, from people who were actually designing the spaceships to people who were helping clean up the facilities in which all this stuff was happening. So it can be an incredibly energizing force. It also shapes and coordinates behavior. So to give you an example of 2 organizations, Zappos and Nordstrom, that are very customer service oriented, everybody at those organizations knows that. and they are focused towards that end goal. So instead of organizations always having to say things like, well, do whatever you need to do for the customer, people there know that. And they know that they are given sort of free rein in terms of how they make that happen. So it really saves a lot of time in terms of coordinating behavior. One famous example of a strong culture that helped coordinate behavior was the Tylenol cyanide scare or tragedy, really, in the early 1980s. So if you've heard of the story, you know that in the early 1980s, 7 people in Chicago died from Tylenol capsules that were laced with cyanide. And once, it took a while for people to figure out why these people, what the cause of the cyanide poisoning was. But when they finally linked it to extra strength Tylenol, Johnson & Johnson famously pulled 31 million bottles of Tylenol off the shelf across the country. That was a decision that cost them $100 million in revenue. They stopped advertising for the product, and it was an incredibly costly decision. It was also credited with saving many lives because there were still likely more tainted bottles out there, and with helping the company recover public trust. Right, when something like this happens, there's a huge loss of public trust. And this is a case that is taught at business schools everywhere because it's really a case where an organization didn't hesitate to do something that was, short-term very costly financially, but long-term probably saved lives and also saved the health of the company. It soon regained kind of its previous market share. And this decision to pull the drug is attributed to a culture in which the primary goal was safety. Right? This was the cultural value that was enacted, that was espoused, and that empowered managers to do whatever they felt needed to be done to ensure safety. And one of the things that's really, I think, interesting about this story is that the decision to pull all of these Tylenol bottles off the shelf was not made by the CEO. And the reason it wasn't made by the CEO is because the CEO was on the plane when all of this news broke. Instead, it was made by a brand manager at Tylenol. And it sort of speaks to the power and the emphasis on that goal, that person was able to make this huge unilateral and expensive decision without going through kind of the higher ups, because this was such a strong cultural value at Tylenol. It wasn't even something that person thought a lot about. It was obvious what the right thing to do was from Tylenol's perspective. So a couple things. The cost of strong cultures, right? These aren't costless. Sometimes when everybody is kind of sharing the same values, has the same assumptions, there's a reluctance to question those things, and that can be costly in all sorts of ways. One way is that it insulates people from kind of a diversity of perspectives, from a diversity of ideas. People who work in strong cultures that don't kind of feel adherence to those values often feel very uncomfortable there. They feel coerced, they feel pressured to comply with norms, and pretty deeply unhappy. And these organizations have a really hard time changing, right? These are very deeply held values, and it can be hard for organizations to change them. There are lots of examples of times when cultures were hurt by being too strong. And a classic case is Kodak's very slow move into digital photography in the 1990s, partly because they had a strong collegial culture in which people, didn't believe that their brand that had done so well for so many decades would possibly slowly becoming obsolete, and a resistance to kind of considering that possibility ultimately led them to be very slow to evolve into that field and very slow to catch up. Culture only works when it's sort of aligned with an organization's strategy. So having a strong culture that doesn't work for the industry and what the industry and organization it's in can itself be costly. So if you think about Southwest, right, some of the cultural values I talk about are all about the employee-centered, showing that employees are appreciated, recognized, celebrated. And the kind of central message underlying all of this is that we all work together. We're all in this together. And if you think about it, it really helps Southwest achieve their strategic objectives, which are incredibly high volume, quick turnaround. They have a much quicker turnaround than any other airline, and short, convenient flights. And having a teamwork environment really helps succeed, make that goal happen. In a case where culture didn't necessarily help an organization, you only have to look to Dell Computers, which has lost market share rapidly over the last decade or two. And the dominant cultural value there has always been cost efficiency and competitiveness. But increasingly, people are interested in not just having cost-effective computers, but computers that are sleek and innovative and stylish. So I want to give you kind of 3 ways to create, perpetuate, or change an organizational culture. And the 3 classic ways have to do with selection, socialization, and rewards and punishment. Now, in terms of selection, organizations who really care about culture take selection incredibly seriously, right? They want to have the right people. It is harder, it's often said it's harder to kind of make a person fit into a culture than to teach them how to do the job. So in a famous example at Zappos, the CEO has a deal with employees, and the deal is this: if you do our training program for whatever it is, 2 weeks or a month, at the end, I'm going to make you a deal that if you quit today, if you decide this isn't right for you, this is not my kind of culture, then we'll pay you for the amount of time you worked, plus we'll give you a $1,000 bonus. And the idea is that we want the right people here. If this is not the right place for you, please go find the right place for you. There are also socialization tactics that organizations use. So you can find examples from E-Trade to what Marines go through in the military, right? The boot camp, where they're basically shown, kind of indoctrinated into the Marine way of doing things. To Zappos, where companies do kind of these Saturday Night Live type skits to show what values they encourage, what things actually would get you fired there. To E-Trade, where people are encouraged to share embarrassing stories to kind of bring them all together. And if you think, a lot of times in organizations, we all have stories about the time that we were hired, right? The kind of new employee moment in an organization is a really important time, and a really important time for how we think about our jobs, how we think about what this organization cares about, and what they value. So we often remember the details around this event, and this is something that organizations can really do to kind of first kind of tell people about their values, to transmit their values. And this is a real opportunity for organizations to do that. Now, so far we've talked about primarily about how organizations socialize new employees, but organizations with very strong cultures are doing this all the time. They're reinforcing these cultures all the time. One way they do this is, again, through the stories, right? You can imagine at the Mayo Clinic, the story of the wedding probably, is something that's told again and again. And in some large organizations, there are even storytellers, people who go kind of tell stories about the organization to make sure people know the values. There's a famous story at Starbucks, which used to be told by the former CEO, Howard Schultz, and he would tell a story about how to improve, how he forbade employees from ever re-steaming milk, right? He cared a lot about quality, and so you weren't allowed to re-steam milk. Well, the problem, or the consequence of this practice, was that a lot of times there was extra milk, and that milk was poured down the drain, and it cost millions of dollars in milk, and was also extremely wasteful. So he often tells this story of one of his store managers who came up with a very simple but yet brilliant suggestion of putting an etched line inside the steaming pitcher, so that a barista would know how much milk you needed and wouldn't waste or have to pour any milk down the drain. And this innovation ended up saving the company millions of dollars, literally in lost milk, and it didn't sacrifice the quality. So the story here emphasizes kind of 2 core values. One, maintaining quality no matter what. And the second, innovation, right? And so kind of this story encompasses both of those values within one story. A final way of rewarding or perpetuating culture is how you reward people. This is also a critically important way of underscoring what really matters at the organization. To give you an example of this, CompUSA which is no longer, was known for being an incredibly aggressive culture in which individual performance mattered above all else. And so this was emphasized in the way that people were rewarded. So when you would go to sales meetings, regional sales meetings, sales managers would sit around the table in order of their numbers. So if you were the highest performing sales manager, you would sit closest to the executive, and then you would go back depending on how poorly performing you are. So it was very clear to everybody where you stood in the hierarchy. When you had on your name tag, you also had your shrinkage numbers, kind of a badge of shame of money you'd lost the company. And in these meetings, it's reported that when people were given rewards, they were often given kind of these lumps of cash. So people were actually physically given, wads of cash as a reward. So very clearly emphasizing this value of competitiveness, financial rewards, of individual performance. All of these things were emphasized in this one, quarterly meeting. So how organizations reward and punish people is a huge way that they perpetuate culture or that they create a culture. Now, I've talked mainly about organizational culture from the perspective of the organization and what it can help the organization accomplish. But I also think it's important to understand it from the perspective of the employee, right? Because all of us are, architects of our own careers, are trying to, find an optimal organization for what our values are, for what our interests are, for what our strengths and weaknesses are. And when you think about an organization's culture, it really is an incredibly important component to how well you will do there in an organization, and also how satisfied and committed to that organization you will be. So a study that I want to end with focused on, asking MBA students when they were in graduate school, what kind of organization would you prefer to work in? Would you like one that has a lot of flexibility and discretion, or would you like one that's very stable and more control oriented? There are a whole host of different dimensions on which people were asked what kind of culture they preferred. And then they interviewed them 1 or 2 years after graduation, and they were asked to report on the characteristics of the culture in which the organization in which they were part of. And what they found was that kind of the greater the match between what people had felt in graduate school and what they actually, what organization they were actually found themselves in, the more satisfied employees were with their jobs, the more committed they were to that organization, and the less likely they were to leave. So across all of these metrics, right, it matters not just for the organization and its ability to be successful, but also for the individual and that person's ability to be successful. So just to sum up, when you look at organizations, you can think and you try to decipher their culture, you can really see kind of these things above the iceberg very easily. But below the iceberg is really where kind of the really important differences are likely to be. And that there are a lot of benefits to strong cultures, but there are costs as well. And organizations need to be aware of those, especially if they're trying to foster a stronger culture. And then if you want to perpetuate or change a culture, that it's really important to focus on, what people you hire, how you socialize those people both at the beginning and ongoing, and also how you reward or punish those employees as well. So that's my presentation for today. I'm happy to take any questions you might have or respond to any kind of thoughts or observations you may have. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Bianchi, for the very insightful presentation. We have quite a few questions, so let's dive right into it. So to combine a few questions actually here from Terry and Sasha, they talk about company culture, organizational culture in more remote areas when they have an international organization. So how can culture be achieved with more remote offices like this or international offices, and how much should they focus on subcultures?
So I'm assuming there's kind of a disconnect between, is the question kind of about a disconnect between the kind of the local culture and maybe the organization's entire culture?
Mm-hmm.
So going on that assumption, I mean, organizations aren't in a vacuum, right? An organization's culture is affected by what's going on around it. right? The community in which it resides, the state in which it resides, the country in which it resides. And so organizations that are completely at odds with those norms often struggle. Because it's hard for people both to have values that fit into kind of their community culture and also the organizational culture. So this is a problem a lot of times when companies are international and they have, you know, different values and different cultures. But a lot of times that's when you see kind of these subcultures emerge, right? Where they take some parts of the culture that have been important to its success, but they also are respectful and understanding of kind of some parts of the culture that you know, may not fit in as well in the particular community in which that office or branch resides. So it is a very difficult balancing act, and one that managers have to be kind of cognizant of and thoughtful about.
Thank you for that. And William here has a question on, are the outcomes equally good for strong cultures, whether they're negative or positive cultures? You know, he's wondering, many corporate cultures seem to be media darlings, but they're toxic to so many of their employees. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, so there, you know, I talked mainly about strong cultures that are positive, but there is absolutely no question that there are strong cultures that are negative, right? So negative in the sense that people are unhappy there, right? Or negative in the sense that they often, you know, then they later get entangled in sort of legal messes, or in widespread unethical behavior, right? If you look at Enron, that was a very strong culture. That was a culture which was very strong in terms of competitiveness, in terms of they had what's called a rank and yank system where people were encouraged basically to throw everybody else under the bus and try to, you know, emerge as one of the few people who got to keep their job every year. 20% of people were cut every year. So yes, there are cultures, and was that a successful organization for a while? But ultimately, I think many people would argue that that culture led to its demise. So it, you know, it is a little bit, you know, when organizations have a culture which is promoting values that, you know, lead to unethical behavior, then it's undoubtedly kind of a negative culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And then taking a step back, we talk about strong cultures, but in the process of building cultures, why do you think most organizations struggle to form and maintain a strong culture?
So I think it goes back to kind of the two things that I talked about earlier with what makes a strong culture. So you have to have both an agreement and values. And I think that that is a really strong challenge for a lot of organizations, right? That some people might value competitiveness, other people might value efficiency, other people might value collaboration. And to get everybody really on the same page, it is a huge challenge. And so if people aren't on the same page or if people don't agree on the values, then that's, you know, you're not gonna have a strong culture. The other part of it is the intensity of that value. So I've certainly worked at organizations in the past where, you know, everybody saw the credo and everybody saw the values on the wall, but people didn't really feel that strongly or passionately about them. They kind of felt like corporate speak. They didn't feel like things that really mattered to their everyday lives, to their kind of jobs in the real life. So I think those are the two reasons, or two primary reasons. I think there are a lot of other reasons as well, but I think those are the two primary challenges organizations face.
Hmm. And then talking about building culture and maybe having negative culture, Gina here is wondering if you have any suggestions for changing this negative culture that might have been instilled for years, you know, changing the mindset of directors and administrative leadership.
So I think it is almost impossible for anybody who's not in the leadership levels to change a culture. Because if you think about kind of what I talked about in terms of perpetuating and changing culture, it's really about, you know, who you hire, how you socialize those people, and how you reward those people. And those are things that are, you know, really in the purview in most organizations of the management, of top management. So changing a culture is absolutely possible. It is incredibly hard. And the reason it's hard is because it requires organizations to really kind of all work together to change it. And if only a few people want to change it, then it's probably not going to really stick. So it is possible, but it is incredibly challenging.
Great. We're almost at time, but we'll just take one more question. A lot of people come to us for career advice. Do you think it's possible, or how can it be done to kind of gauge the company culture through the interview process, or before you start a job?
That's an excellent question. And I think it's an as so I mean, I would recommend talking to a lot of people, maybe not so much in your formal interview, but people who work there. And one of the kind of best pieces of advice I've ever seen about this is to ask people who work for that company, what is something that would happen here that wouldn't happen somewhere else? Right. And so that can give you kind of an insight into what's unique about this place. And is that thing that's unique, is that something that's going to work for me, or is that going to be a problem for me? Because, with every strong culture, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of people who would not be happy in there. And you might be one of them. So it could be an incredibly strong and positively strong culture, but that doesn't mean that everybody fits there. So I think that's an incredibly important thing to gauge and to try to figure out, because as I mentioned before, if it's not a good fit, you're not likely to be happy and you're not likely to do as well there. So it is an important thing, but I think that question can really kind of help get at the things below the iceberg, which is what you really want to do, right? You can go in and see all the corporate speak and you can see kind of the espoused values, but you want to know like what really gets people fired, what really gets people promoted, who is successful here, right? Who is not successful, who doesn't do well here. That's what I would want to know.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Professor Bianchi. This is a lot of food for thought. Do you have any last tips, last things you would like the audience to know?
Um, no, I just would want to reiterate this idea that, as we all are architects of our own career and thinking about kind of where we would fit best and where we'd be happiest. I think this is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle. I talk to a lot of students and they understandably are often concerned about, well, what job's going to look good on my resume? What job pays me this much more? And of course, those are important variables, but this is an important variable too. And I think it's, where people will fit well. Does that organization kind of inspire you? Is it a place you want to be every day? Because we spend a tremendous amount of time at work, and being inspired or being kind of energized at work is really an immeasurable gift. And it's one that very few people have, but those that do benefit tremendously from.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Bianchi, again, and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.